G'day YouTube. I'd like to talk about patriotic malevolence and Putin's Ukrainistan. Now we'll mention patriotism first. There's a lot of people who honestly believe, because they've been taught in their youth, that patriotism is a great, productive, good thing. I disagree strongly. I prefer to align myself with Dr. Samuel Johnson's view that patriotism is the last and final refuge of the scoundrel. Now, from memory, once upon a time there was a man called Pierre Chauvin. Pierre Chauvin, surprisingly enough, was a Frenchman. France was involved in a war. Pierre Chauvin was asked his opinion on the morals or the ethics of the war, and his response was, "My country, right or wrong." So any individual who believed that they did not need to investigate the facts of the situation because they were going to align themselves with France because they were French, they were called chauvinists. And there was a bunch of people all around the world who decided that was a great and marvellous idea, but they weren't French. Yet they wanted to align themselves recklessly, heedlessly, unthinkingly, blindly with whatever was the policy of the government of the day in their country of birth. And because people who lived outside their country of birth were known as expatriots, they were living outside their fatherland, because pater is Latin for father. This concept of supporting one's country, right or wrong, became known as patriotism. Patriotism. And isn't it strange how often it is that the self-proclaimed patriots are the ones who go out on the street and riot? That's patriotism, the last and final refuge of a scoundrel. If you can't find any productive use for yourself anywhere else in the economy, you can always go and volunteer to join the military and say that your motivation is not looking for a job to get paid so you can eat at night. You can say your motivation is to defend the flag, and you'll sign on to become a soldier. Isn't that what a soldier does? Puts their soul on the line, risks dying, a soldier. You know, like the labels are on these things. It's not difficult. And when people have been polishing a gun, fantasising about how brave they might be and how big their gun is and how powerful it is and how destructive it is, especially when they get together with their mates in the barracks, they very rarely consider the idea that other people might have more guns and bigger guns. So you get the situation of 175,000 military in Ukraine being ordered to stand firm against 750,000 in the Russian military, and there's 150,000 of the Russian military already on the Ukrainians' border. But I get ahead of myself. Patriotism. Patriotic malevolence. Now, malevolence is another one of those funny words that has the key to its meaning locked into its spelling. Malevolence, the essence of evil, it's male violence with I removed. Male violence in which I make no appearance. So as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, any violence the Ukrainian males, military, soldiers, might like to indulge in, that'll be okay, because the Ukrainians are involved on that side of it. It's their patriotic duty to support their violent males. The Russians have the exact same viewpoint, but they're supporting the Russian patriotic, malevolent males. Right? Now, there's history, there's backstory to all this. Once upon a time, the Ukraine was a bit of a peasant backwater and a breadbasket, and the farming was done by kulaks who owned the land, peasant farmers. Lenin read a book on Marx, and with Stalin's help they started trying to implement the shit. And one of the things they wanted to do was to collectivise the agriculture in the United Soviet Socialist Republics, and that required land. And the kulaks weren't interested in giving the land to the communists, so the communists requisitioned, impounded, confiscated the harvests of the kulaks until the kulaks had starved to death, about 10 or 15 million of them. And the ethnic Ukrainian kulaks, who used to be the peasant farmers in the Ukraine, they were replaced by otherwise unskilled, unemployable Russian serfs and peasants. Ethnic Russian peasants, Russian-speaking peasants, who were pretty good at standing up straight in neat lines and saluting and saying, "Sir, yes, sir," asking how high after they'd been ordered to jump and their feet had already left the ground. So, come 1941 Operation Barbarossa, when Adolf went on his Grand Napoleonic rerun tour, the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS reached the Ukraine, and there was a whole bunch of ethnic-speaking Ukrainians who'd had it up to here with communism. They welcomed the Nazis with open arms and wreaths and flags and cheering. They were really excited to be liberated from Stalinism by the Nazis. There were other Ukrainians, the ethnic Russian-speaking recent immigrants that I previously mentioned. They didn't like the German invasion at all. I'm pretty sure I've read several books on the phenomenon of pro-Nazi Ukrainian fascists rounding up the Jews for the SS and the Sonderkommando and the Einsatzgruppen. Right? So in the wake of what the Russians, or the USSR, used to describe as the Great Patriotic War, anybody who wears a swastika, who wants to align themselves with a reconstituted Germany so that they can reap the benefits of better economic management, if they're in the Ukraine and they say and they do that, they cannot possibly claim to be surprised when the government in Moscow goes apeshit and labels them a bunch of Nazis and neo-fascists. The fact that the deposed president, prime minister, whatever he was, of Ukraine, the fellow who's now hiding in Russia, the fact that in order to try and stay in power, when the people came out on the streets because they were totally sick of the corruption, of the fact that 49% of everybody in the Ukraine who had anything to do with the police in the last 12 months had to pay a bribe. When the people came out on the streets, the pro-Russian Ukrainian now deposed government put fucking special elite police snipers in position, and they shot 70 or 80 people just for protesting. Apparently that was because one politician in the government in Kiev had suggested that Russian no longer be taught as the primary language in schools in Kiev, and somebody else said that World War II in Kiev, in the Ukraine, should be described as World War II rather than the Great Patriotic War. And it sort of seems to me that both the ethnic-speaking Russians and the ethnic-speaking Ukrainians are on an ancestral guilt trip. They're locked into this phenomenon that when they were infants, they were dandled on somebody's knee and they were told how wicked and evil the people on the other side of the hill were because they were different. It sort of reminds me of a Bosnian refugee who asked me to perform a poem called Anzac Day when I was busking at the local KFC. And I recited the poem, which is about the evils of telling war stories to children and the evils of marching in parades as returned soldiers because, you know, the little kids want to grow up and think they're war heroes too. And this bloke burst into tears and threw $10 in the hat and told me that I was exactly right and that was what had caused all the problems in the Balkans. He went a lot further than me. He said that in order to obtain lasting peace in the Balkans, the United Nations should go in there and round up all the grandmothers and liquidate them. Shoot the grandmothers was his solution, because he said when you're about 2 or 3 years old, they sit you on their knee and they bounce you up and down, and they tell you you've got to eat your crusts so that your hair will grow curly and you'll get, you know, big strong man when you grow up, and you'll be able to pick up your gun when you're 16 and learn to march in neat straight lines, and then go over the hill and kill the men of the neighbouring tribe and rape all their women and steal all their crops and produce in order to get even for their umpty-ump great-grandfather stealing your umpty-ump great-uncle's pig 600 years ago. It's a national vendetta culture, and it devolves into smaller and smaller and smaller groups until eventually, you know, you get people on either side of the valley having internecine family feuds under the vendetta principle. But yeah, the ethnic-speaking Russians in the Ukraine are afraid of being liquidated by the descendants of the dispossessed kulaks, and the dispossessed kulaks' descendants are afraid of being liquidated by the ethnic-speaking Russians because of what happened when Hitler was on his grand Napoleonic rerun tour. Meanwhile, Germany gets 60% of its LP gas, which becomes 40% of its electricity, from a pipeline that runs through the Ukraine and comes from Mother Russia. The Ukraine itself is not an economically sustainable entity, and it depends on cheap subsidised LP gas from Mother Russia. Russia won in Georgia. Russia has not been actually losing to the Chechens. Russia conferred with and sought the approval of and obtained the approval of the People's Republic of China before Russian troops with no insignia occupied the Crimea. And there lies the crux of the issue. The United States and Britain, they've busted their armies. What did they have? They had Iraq, then they had Afghanistan, then they had Iraq again, then they had Absurdistan still, and for 12 years they've turned all the career soldiers into gibbering wrecks, burnt out from PTSD and rattling from the number of pills they take to try and stop the daymares during the day and let them sleep at night without levitating off the bed while they're screaming during their reruns, talking to the midnight visitors, the people that they looked at through gun sights and squeezed off on. The military machinery, it's full of sand, its engines chewed out, the tracks are fucked. The tanks aren't capable of going up against brand new Russian tanks that haven't been worn out. There was a bit of a flurry when it was announced that NATO had doubled its number of aircraft patrolling the borders of Turkey and the Balkans in order to stand up to the Russian aggression. Yep, and then the next day they announced it slightly different, trying to change the newsline. NATO has dispatched 6 more United States F-16s to help patrol the Turkish border. Okay, so they doubled their fighter strength, and that took them up by 6. So they now have 12 F-16s that America is using to patrol Turkish airspace. A couple of countries away from the Ukraine where anything's actually happening. Now, there'd be Moldavia and Romania that you'd have to cross over, and that would require air-to-air refuelling because jet fighters have got fuck all range. So now the Americans are trying to posture, and they're discovering that none of the other NATO countries has any appetite for a shooting match or a pissing competition with Poohtin. I think Putin's won. I think they're probably going to draw a line somewhere north-south oriented around the Crimean Peninsula, and there's going to become the Ukrainian rump, Western Ukraine, where they speak Ukrainian, and it's full of ethnic Ukrainians, and they're not going to be particularly financially viable. And there's going to be southern and eastern Ukraine, maybe Ukrainistan we can call it, you know, in honour of all the other stands that Russia keeps as satellite border countries tethered on a string of endless economic support to prop them up, because it's useful to have them there in case anybody else wants to invade Mother Russia. You have a skirt, an apron of other countries that they have to get through. And what can I do about it from here in Australia? Well, I'm ranting on YouTube, but that's about all. I don't buy anything Ukrainian. I don't sell anything to the Ukraine. I think it's curious that not long after I made a movie where I ranted about the great similarity between Putin's actions in the Ukraine, attempting to justify what he's doing by citing the alleged depredations being visited on ethnic-speaking Russians in the Ukraine by the wicked, evil, neo-fascist Nazi Ukrainians. So he's going, you know, to put the military in there to rescue his ethnic Russian citizens. So he's claiming people from another country are his citizens. He needs to protect them because of, you know, their ancestry. And all I can think of is Danzig, 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 Danzig. Adolf Hitler, Danzig, Danzig, Danzig. Oh, the fucking terrible threat posed to the German fragile, delicate little pansies, panzers, lined up on the Polish border by all those wicked, evil, terrifying Russian cavalry troops with their horses and their sabres. Oh, Danzig, 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 the Danzig Corridor, the poor little ethnic Germans in the Danzig Corridor being monstered by the wicked, evil Poles wearing, you know, hairnets and perfume to bed, and I'm talking about the officers. So Hitler goes into Poland with a secret agreement with Stalin to meet in the middle and partition Poland, but it was all justified by the need, allegedly, to rescue the ethnic Germans in the Danzig Corridor. And now Pootin, claiming that it's all being set off by the rise of neo-fascism, he's doing the same thing. Oh, my ethnic-speaking Russian citizens out there in Ukraine, I have to go and rescue them. Yeah. And the mass media on all sides seem to be buying it, whichever side they want to buy and recycle. And meanwhile, as Laura Leela said in a couple of her videos, there's shit going down that's equally as bad all over the place. In Thailand, they've got a Prime Minister who's the sister of a deposed, corrupt, exiled Prime Minister, but he's got such a good grip on the electoral demographics that he can get his sister elected as a puppet. Therefore, the protesters on the streets in Bangkok are throwing hand grenades at the police because they want less democracy. They want to be able to appoint a People's Committee because they figure democracy gives them an unwinnable solution. In Burma, you know, the poster child for democratic perseverance, Aung San Suu Kyi, she's walking arm in arm with the military and denying the ethnic tribespeople citizenry. You know, they've only been living there since time immemorial, but oh no, you know, like, fuck them. We're only worried about the people in the industrialised areas. So Aung San Suu Kyi, sell out. Venezuela, everybody's rioting because, you know, Chavez is dead and nobody can figure out how to make it go without his charisma. Brazil, everybody's rioting because their economy's falling to pieces, their society is disintegrating, and the government keeps spending money building a fucking set of sports grounds for a football game in the daydream that all the people around the world who can't afford to go on holidays are going to flock in there and spend money at the World Cup. I don't think Argentina's doing too well either. But the reason everybody's paying attention to the Ukraine is because there's so many ex-Soviet era military bases jam-packed with weapons in Ukraine, and don't forget there's still 9 or a dozen suitcase bombs missing from the Soviet disintegration. What people are worried about is that the provisional government in Kiev will bomb fucking Sevastopol or Simferopol or even Moscow with an unearthed ex-Soviet era nuke. And if that happens, yeah, what will Premier Putin, the neo-Tsarist emperor of Russia, do then? Is he going to blame that on the West? I don't see how you can actually blame the West for being anything other than avaricious and dreaming that if they invest Ukraine into the European Union, they will have another market to sell shit into. It's just greedy businessmen in the West not thinking about the geopolitics. But yeah, that's my take on patriotic malevolence and Putin's Ukrainistan. For what it's worth, from the other side of the world. And if I actually knew anybody in the Ukraine, I doubt I would be able to sustain anywhere near as balanced a view. In order to understand a bunch of people fighting over shit that doesn't matter, the best thing to do is be a fucking long way away. Distance grants perspective. Ideally, we'd all live on, well, I'd live on Mars and observe the Earth with a telescope and a radio. No point going to the moon because, well, Earthlings are starting to go back there. The Chinese. And that's, like I said, China has the newest and most modern manned Earth orbital launch capacity. China launches more satellites than America does on a monthly basis these days, on a yearly basis. If China says it's okay for Putin to carve a slice off the Ukraine, to make him feel better, to make the ethnic Russian-speaking Ukrainians feel better, China says it's okay. It doesn't matter what the West say. It doesn't matter what America says, because China has given its okay. And Osama bin Laden and Sad Man Who's Insane, they ethnically cleansed America out of low Earth orbit. America wasted the money invading places that didn't matter, and they had nothing left for the space program. Same as Ho Chi Minh, ethnically cleansed America off the moon. Now the Chinese are going to go up there and they're going to go and visit all the American landing sites, and they're going to come back with the flag and the plaque, and they're going to auction them on eBay. Right? What's the Yanks going to do to stop that? Zip, zero, zilch, because they have to buy a ride on a Russian spaceship in order to get to the International Space Station. China said it's okay, so it doesn't matter what Obama thinks. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. You put that one in your pipe and smoke it. Ciao.